Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Reports Weekly Cyber Report, sponsored by Northrop Grumman. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Joining us today is retired United States Navy Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, the Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that recently issued 53 recommendations to improve the nation's overall cybersecurity. The panel was chaired by Maine Independent Senator Angus King and Wisconsin Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher. The Senate Homeland Security Committee convened remotely this week to hear from King and Gallagher, as well as two commissioners, former Department of Homeland Security Cyber Chief Susanna Spalding, as well as Tom Fanning, the chairman and CEO of the Southern Company, one of the nation's leading utilities. Admiral Montgomery, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Vago. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
Pleasure having you on. It was a great hearing. And there is a concern that even though more Americans are more dependent than ever on remote working and access to connectivity, that the issue of cybersecurity is going to fall by the wayside in the wake of what's been a devastating pandemic causing economic as well as security carnage in its wake. Senator King was right in saying that if somebody attacks our networks now, it's going to be even more devastating. How do you keep the focus on this issue to actually enact a series of very long overdue recommendations?
Well, thanks. The first thing I'd say is I think we had momentum going on this issue. When Senator McCain created this commission, it was because he had come to the conclusion after 3 to 4 years of trying to get his hands around it as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and working with the executive branch, that the problem had become too hard for the executive branch or legislative branch to fix together, and that they needed some independent insight to kind of give the drive. So he assigned us to go take a look at two things. First, what's the right strategic approach to defend our critical infrastructure against a significant cyber attack? And second, once you have that strategic approach, what are the right legislative and policy remedies to enact the approach? And so this came from a recognition by him and the other members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I think more broadly the legislature in general. The cybersecurity issue was front and center. Now, look, the pandemic crisis has certainly distracted from the release of our report, but that's fine because I think in a lot of ways the pandemic crisis and really the response of the federal government to it demonstrates that a lot of the recommendations we had in cyber are correct. In other words, some of the recommendations we have about the need to plan for an event ahead of time, the need to have strategic leadership ahead of an event, planning the resources of the federal government, building the relationships between the federal government and the private sector so that you can respond aggressively and effectively to a crisis when it hits, have been, our recommendations that have been validated by the challenges we've had in responding to the pandemic crisis. So I think the problems that drove the recognition that we needed a cyberspace solarium commission still exist, and the pandemic crisis has validated a number of our solutions. So I say, even though we've been delayed in our rollout events and in how we're doing the hearings and everything, this actually gives us the opportunity to really make our case in this year's legislative process and next year's legislative process and get a lot of our recommendations turned into law.
Agreed that it actually helps make the broader case about why it's so important given how many people are dependent on it. And I think that Senator McCain deserves a massive debt of gratitude for having recognized as a very strategic thinker what that challenge was. But change is very, very hard to impose on organizations and tends to happen when everybody sort of has an aha moment and says, wow, we really have got to do this. And to date, some of that's been very spotty, even within the military services, even within military services that pride themselves on having some kind of strategic acumen. Are we there yet? Or conversely, is this pandemic, a positive thing of this pandemic is to help drive that change? I mean, are we at that aha, holy crap, we've really got to do something moment from your standpoint?
That's a great question. And working in the commission, we felt, I was working for 14 commissioners who definitely understood we were at that moment. But your broader question is the executive branch willing to change? Is the legislative branch willing to change without that significant event? In other words, can we create the Department of Homeland Security without 9/11? And the answer is that's very hard, and it's going to be challenging. And that's why I think we worked hard to take the the initiatives that have already been done. So 2008, we created the NCI JTF at the FBI. They're the law enforcement cyber investigators. In 2009, we created U.S. Cyber Command. 2014 and 15, we created, it took about 2.5 years, we created CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. So we have, over the last 8 years, created the ligature for a successful government organization. We're still missing a few things. First, those groups need to be properly empowered. That's specifically about CISA. It has to be properly resourced and separated internally from the Department of Homeland Security to operate more as an independent agency like FEMA does inside the Department of Homeland Security. Second, we need to make sure that Cyber Command has the right level of forces. We recommend a force structure assessment because the force structure of the Cyber Mission Force, which is about 6,200 on-net operators, was established back in 2013 based on an assessment of the adversary, China and Russia, done in 2012, and the operational concepts that were in play at that time. We have a more aggressive and higher capacity set of adversaries, and we have new requirements with defend forward and persistent engagement. We're probably going to need a much larger cyber mission force to tackle that. And then finally, we need strategic leadership. And what we recommend there is a national cyber director. And that's going to be the hard action, I think. It's going to be hard for the National Security Council to give up this responsibility that has sat at varying levels of seniority inside the NSC. Whether you take Tom Bossert as kind of a high point or, just having a senior director do it, cybersecurity mission has sat inside the NSC. We recommend pulling it out, putting it standalone inside the executive office of the president, someone akin to the U.S. trade representative. In other words, someone who functionally controls one policy area for the president, somebody who serves at the cabinet level to interact with other cabinet agencies to make sure the president's national cyber strategy is integrated across all the agencies, someone who serves as a focal point for CEOs to come to so that he can help CISA build that public-private partnership and collaboration that's going to be critical to defending our national critical infrastructure, and someone who can coordinate the defensive cyber operations, campaign development, and response to cyber incidents as they happen. And what we've learned from the pandemic crisis is exactly what you implied, which is that the pandemic crisis has shown us that this type of strategic leadership inside the White House, to work with the interagency and work with the private sector is critical in the preparation for an event, the initial response to the event, and then the long-term recovery from an event. And therefore, with a national cyber director, I think we'll have completed the structural changes that are necessary to have an effective executive branch approach to this.
How do you keep up the pressure, and what are the next steps, right? The good part is that the administration had a representative that sat on the commission, so everybody from all the key departments were constantly briefed and participated, I think, in the 29 meetings you guys had. Lawmakers are already building templates and blueprints. The chairs are working. I should have mentioned Jim Langevin as well, who was part of this, to try to get all the committee chairs to give up their authorities from a congressional level. How do we keep up the pressure, and what are the next steps?
First, I should have addressed what you averred to there, which is that there's a final element of this is reforming Congress. In other words, taking the 40 to 50 to 60 or so committees and subcommittees that have some responsibility for cyber and creating one select committee for cyber in the House and one select committee for cyber in the Senate that deals with the strategic implementation of a national cyber strategy. Right now, there's no place in Congress where you look at the integrated defense of the United States against a significant cyber attack. There's a challenge with this, though. We don't reform Congress easily. It took 9/11 to get the Homeland Security Committees created. It took the Church Commission report to get the Senate Select Committee on and House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence created. It takes dramatic events. And so I really worry that probably the hardest change will be the legislative change, which is why it's even more important that the National Cyber Director be Senate confirmed. So even if you can't fix the Congress, if you fix the executive branch and have one strategic center point, that person can be brought into various committees to discuss his view, what he sees as the strategic effect going on, the strategic implementation effect, and then that way you can do oversight, not the proper way, which would be one Senate and House committee, one Senate committee and one House committee, but by at least having one person and provide input on for oversight. When it comes to the issue of how do we implement this, you got it exactly right. Representative Jim Langevin and the other chairmen of relevant cyber subcommittees in armed services and homeland and intelligence are now taking a look at our 57 legislative proposals and determining which one of them belong in their bill. Do they, can something be put into the National Defense Authorization Act, either on the House or Senate side, and then conference through and be part of the final law. So our first effort is to try to get things in the National Defense Authorization Act that belong in the National Defense Authorization Act. And that'll certainly be all the DoD items we recommended that the House and Senate staffs agree with, and some of the DoD plus other agency items. But that still leaves a number of important recommendations that have to find another vehicle to become law. And so we'll take a look at various options, whether it's bills that are passed in the next 4 to 6 months on how to implement recovery from the pandemic. If they have some kind of carryover with that, we'll try to use those bills. We could also have freestanding bills on cybersecurity. Some pass each year, not many, but some pass each year. So we'll take a look at those. And then obviously we can take a look at the next year's NDAA for a final bite at the apple. But there's going to be multiple opportunities to turn the legislative proposals that were written by the commission as part of their recommendations, inserted into bills, after some modification, and then turned into law, hopefully over time.
Sir, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Vago. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. We'll see you again tomorrow.